Hello and welcome to the lecture series. In this video, we'll focus on pollination. In flowering plants, both male and female gametes are non-motile. So in order to ensure gamete transfer, pollen grains from anthers are transferred to the stigma of a pistil through a process known as pollination. Let us learn about the types of pollination. First category is autogamy, also known as self-pollination, which takes place within the same flower. For autogamy to take place, there should be less physical distance between male and female reproductive parts, which means that stigma and anther should really be lying close to each other, and there must be synchrony between the release of pollen and reception by stigma. Autogamy takes place in flowers that do not open, known as cleistogamous flower. This image shows that pollen grains produced from anthers of this flower are being transferred to the stigma of same flower in order to ensure self-pollination taking place between them. Jatonogamy is another type of pollination where pollination takes place between different flowers of same plant. Pollen grains from an anther of one flower will be landing onto stigma of another flower of same plant. This produces genetically similar offsprings as in case of autogamy, but technically this is cross-pollination between two different flowers of the same plant. The last category is allogamy, which is also known as cross-pollination or xenogamy. This takes place between two different plants. So pollen grains from an anther of one flower of one plant will be getting transferred to the stigma of another flower of another plant. So it altogether produces genetically different offsprings. As you can observe in this image that cross-pollination is taking place between two flowers of two different plants. Anthers from one flower is being transferred to the stigma of another flower. Allogamy or cross-pollination is favored under certain conditions. The first one is dicliny or unisexuality, which is when male and female reproductive parts are present on different flowers of same or different plants. The second condition is self-sterility or self-incompatibility, where the male gamete of one flower is unable to fertilize female gamete of the same flower. Third condition is dichogamy, which includes both protandry and protogamy. It is when male and female sex organs mature at different times. Protandry is when the anthers mature first, as in case of sunflower, and protogamy is when carpels mature first, as in case of mustard. The next condition is heterostyly, where some flowers have two or three forms of anthers and stigmas at different levels. Finally, it is hercogamy, where there is a natural physical barrier between androecium and gynoecium preventing self-pollination. All these conditions will allow cross-pollination to take place and will prevent self-pollination taking place between them. What are the agents of pollination? How does it take place? There are two basic categories. Abiotic, where wind and water is the medium for pollination, and second is biotic, where living organisms are the reason behind pollination taking place. Let us look into the abiotic agents first. The first type is anemophily, where pollination takes place by wind. This is more common among the abiotic factors. For pollination to take place through wind, pollen grains should be light and sticky, and stamens should be exposed for the easy dispersion of pollen grains. At the same time, stigma should be large and feathery so that it can easily trap the airborne pollen. Flowers are usually without color, nectar or scent, and accessory floral parts are not exposed. Some of the examples are flowers of corn and grasses. Hydrophily is pollination taking place by water. It is less common than anemophily and is rarely observed among flowering plants. The flowers are small and they lack color, nectar or udder. There are two subcategories: Hyperhydrophily is when pollination takes place below the water surface. Female flowers remain submerged in water and the long ribbon-like pollen grains are released in water and protected from wetting by mucilaginous covering, as observed in seagrasses and zostera. On the contrary, epihydrophily is pollination over the water surface. In majority of the aquatic plants, flowers will emerge above water level and pollination will take place through wind or by insects. These are observed in Vallisneria, water lily, and water hyacinth. Among biotic agents, the first category is entomophily, where pollination takes place by insects. Bees are the most dominant pollinating agents. Other insects are butterfly, wasp, fly, beetle, ant, and moth. In each of these cases, the flowers should be large with color, nectar, and scent so that they can attract insects to visit them. In some cases, they also produce edible pollen grains. Pollen grains are spiny, heavy, and surrounded by a yellow sticky substance known as pollen kit. Insects also get rewarded for visiting flowers and bringing about pollination in them. The floral rewards for insects are pollen grains, nectar, and a safe place to lay eggs. The second category is ornithophily, where pollination takes place by birds. Some of the examples of these birds are sunbirds and hummingbirds. The flowers must be large and they must produce a lot of nectar to attract birds. Flowers also have tubular, cup-shaped or urn-shaped corollas. Malacophily is pollination taking place by snails and chiropterophily is by bats. For chiropterophily to take place, the flowers must be dull with strong fruity smell and must also produce abundant nectar and pollen grains. Pollination also takes place by ants. It is known as myrmecophily, and a lot of large animals like lemurs, rodents, reptiles are also involved in pollination of some flowers. Pollination doesn't guarantee the transfer of right type of pollen. On the basis of whether interaction between pollen and pistil will take place or not, we have categorized pollens among compatible pollen or incompatible pollen. When the pollen grain is of right type, that is, both pollen and stigma are of same species, there is acceptance of pollen by pistil, and interaction between them will lead to post-pollination events resulting into fertilization. But if pollen and stigma are of different species, the pollen is incompatible, so pistil will reject pollen and there won't be any post-pollination event and no fertilization will take place. As you can see here in this example, the two flowers are of different species. So pollen grains from a flower of certain species, when it lands onto the flower of another species, there is incompatibility of pollen grain. So there is no pollen pistil interaction. Pollen is prevented from getting germinated and there won't be any fertilization taking place. On the other hand, when the right type of pollen or the compatible pollen lands onto the stigma of flower of same species, there is interaction between pollen and pistil due to the chemicals secreted by pollen, and this will lead to post-pollination event and will result into fertilization. After a compatible pollination, post-pollination events occur. It begins with a pollen grain producing pollen tubes through one of the germ pores. The pollen tube grows and generative cell divides into two male gametes. Through the chemotropic movement, it further moves intracellularly into the style and then reaches ovary. Inside ovary, it enters into the ovule through micropyle into one of the synergids. Pollen-pistil interaction is a dynamic process. What happens next, we'll learn in the next video. Thank you and stay tuned.